I'm at InfoSec 2024 with Daniel from Acuity Risk Management. Daniel, thank you firstly for spending the time to have a chat with me. How are you today?
Yeah, really well. It's been really good InfoSec so far. Been looking forward to this all day. So happy to answer all your questions.
Fantastic. First question, and something that I'm guessing everybody's wondering, Acuity Risk Management, with want of sounding foolish, what does Acuity Risk Management do?
So Acuity is a company that provides a risk and compliance platform to lots and lots of different types of companies all around the world. Our main goal is to simplify risk, but also put it in a way that can be understood by your board members and used properly by your users. So it's an all-in-one enterprise solution, essentially.
So kind of democratizing risk, so it's useful to the entire company and not some weird spreadsheet or red, amber, green diagram that's only understood by somebody that is only pretending to understand it. It's actually bringing some practical use to managing risk, right?
What we don't want to do is keep the risk management spreadsheet stuck inside the boiler room, right, in the server room that's been converted to the risk department. What we want to do is make it into a meaningful business insight into what's actually going on, so we can make decisions based on finance and based on facts.
So it's looked at more than once a year prior to audit, right?
Yeah, exactly that.
Got you. No, that makes a great sense. When we speak of risk though, something I've been asking a lot around the trade show today is like threats and risks that companies in data and information security are facing today. From your experience and what you're seeing, what's kind of top of mind?
So I would say human error is probably the top risk that I hear about the most. It might not be the one that's talked about the most, but people make mistakes and people make mistakes all the time. So what's really key for businesses to understand is that, yes, whilst your assets are your people, but your people are also your risks as well. So the responsibility of the business, and certainly the responsibility of the risk managers, is to make sure everyone understands what's good practice and what's not so good practice. And to do that, you need something that can help you manage not only your time, but the resources you're spending into those solutions as well.
It's really interesting, and it kind of goes on to something that, again, we've been talking about quite a lot. That's insider risk management and insider threat management, which is, often can be considered the somewhat creepy arm of information security, almost, your secret intelligence organization inside companies. And some say it needn't necessarily be that way, but so, as a CISO myself, it's finding that balance between understanding the risks and not being overly intrusive with members of staff. How do you kind of even begin to strike that balance from your...
Yeah, so one of the things when I go to shows like this, one of the topics I talk about quite a lot in various talks and conferences is turning information security and cybersecurity into something that everyone can understand. So think of your fire and health and safety, right? Everyone knows that you shouldn't put a fork in the microwave in your office kitchen, right? Common sense. But not everyone understands that you shouldn't use an open network and connect your laptop to it, or you shouldn't use a flash drive at all, really, if you can help it. People need to understand that risk is risk. Your fire safety, everyone gets that, it makes sense. So I think it's about translating your cybersecurity issues into real world problems that people understand.
I think as well, I made an announcement recently around this in relation to kind of practicing in tabletop exercises as well, that when we speak of fire safety, we have things like fire drills, we have fire kind of evacuation plans and stuff, and we have kind of, when we design things to be fire resistant and not necessarily kind of burst into flames. And I think with information security, I think a lot of what we try to do is to limit that blast radius, and certainly companies that have taken those initial steps of understanding the risk and putting in the appropriate controls don't have the data equivalent of their office burnt to the ground.
Well, it's a hard thing, I think, for people to translate, but the main thing is you're dealing with normal people. Not everyone is part of a cybersecurity team, not everyone is part of an IT security team, and if something's going to go wrong, it's probably going to be because of one of those people, if it's an insider threat. So it's about finding common ground, which sounds strange considering we're talking about cybersecurity here, but it's understanding what makes sense to people and what people can understand as a real problem or a real issue. And a lot of the time, that's just making it into a real world problem that they not only know about, but can see as well. Everyone knows you shouldn't respond to spam emails in your inbox. Everyone gets that. But not everyone understands that clicking on an email that you don't recognize is actually quite harmful. It's about bridging that gap, and I think using a system like ours to manage, one, what you're helping educate your company with, and also keeping track of the control measures you have in place is really quite key at getting over that gap.
I think it's moving from something doing security to your user base to doing it with them, and it being a collaborative effort of people knowing what their responsibilities and what the right thing to do is, and security empowering to do it and creating a safe space for people to work. Again, if we liken it to the health and safety side, there is a responsibility of our employees not to do things like you say, sticking a fork in a microwave. But on the flip side, there's a responsibility of the business to provide a safe working environment to a certain extent for them to operate. So they don't need to necessarily give that thought to literally everything that they do. There are guardrails to nudge people back into compliance.
Exactly that. And to follow on to your point, in order to put those changes in and be effective, you have to demonstrate a value to the business to actually implement those changes. Everyone understands why you need a fire extinguisher, right? Everyone understands the 50 quid that you need to spend in each room to make sure people don't suffer from a fire or whatever, right? If you can demonstrate the value of controls and demonstrate the values of softwares and various other procedures you might have, you have a much better time getting that through a board or a CFO than you would saying a bunch of jargon they don't understand and will never understand.
True.
So you've got to translate it into something they can understand, which most of the time is just simple zeros and ones.
And on the flip side, I think as well, we talk about cyber risk, we talk about information security risk, but I've heard it said that actually those things notionally don't really exist in a lot of ways. Actually, they're part of the wider business risk, and you need to calculate those, not in isolation, but in relation to the business imperatives of the company you're working for. Patching's a fantastic example, I think. If you were a classic cybersecurity person and a classic kind of compliance person, a critical patch comes out, you patch that immediately, if not sooner.
Yeah.
Whereas when that plan hits the reality of a corporate environment, there's, okay, is this patch tested? Is it going to cause downtime? Is this going to be business impactive? So I think when we as security professionals think around our activities and our risks in the scope of the wider business in supporting business imperatives, I certainly find those conversations become a lot easier when talking to the board.
And I think a really good thing as well, and I know this is an approach that is starting to be really quite widely accepted, is also important to hold people accountable as well, which sounds quite harsh, but at the end of the day, you think, again, in the real world, in the corporate security world, in physical security, if someone lets someone they don't know into the office, they're the one at fault. And people need to understand, as much as they need to be nurtured to understand, they need to know that if something goes wrong that they've willingly caused, maybe they've agreed to a policy which says don't do this and they've done it anyway, that accountability needs to be held by someone. And I think it's always really important that issues have a root cause. Because funny enough, when you tell someone you're now responsible for this problem, they'll do something about it. If it's not your problem, no one's really going to take it seriously unless they have to.
That's a really good point, and kind of useful to know that also people need to have the agency to be able to do it. Again, speaking to people, there's a lot of people, risk owners, that have been assigned risks, but they don't necessarily have the scope or the power to be able to make those changes. So it's assuring that accountability rests with the right people.
Exactly.
Because all too often, basically a lot of risks, all roads lead to CISO at some points where that may not necessarily be the case.
And I would definitely say as well, and I hope it gets adopted more and more, but I feel like the process is really overcomplicated. If you can put a quantitative number on an issue and say, look, if you do this, it's going to cost our business X amount of thousands of pounds. Again, that's another way to maybe, that's a lot of money. I don't want to have to be responsible for that.
And by flip side, by not doing this, we're going to gain this amount of thousands of pounds by not losing it.
Exactly, and that's how you can prioritize where you're investing in your mitigations, because you start to build a big picture, and that's exactly what our platform Stream does, is build a big picture of what works, what doesn't work, and where you need to put your investment into. And when it comes to perhaps maybe yourself going to the board, requesting funding to deal with a problem, if you're going in there with financial figures, you have a lot better time than if you go in there with typical cybersecurity jargon.
Exactly, and fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which certainly isn't the best way to do things.
No.
speaking of, kind of a question we're asking a lot of people, and it's a thorny question about kind of ransomware. Lots of people, everybody, it's a topic du jour. Last year it's AI, arguably this year there's a certain degree of AI, but I'm not going to ask you about that this time. Thank goodness. So governments are talking about public-private partnerships, information sharing, but in the same time they're talking about criminalizing the payments of ransomware demands. Is your thought, is that kind of a practical solution, not a practical solution? Is it the right question?
I don't think it's the correct question. I think we should be enabling and potentially legislating businesses to have the proper procedures in place to avoid the problem entirely. You and me both know ransomware tends to fall into place when systems aren't being updated, or when somebody does something that they probably shouldn't have done in their spam filter. It's not this mysterious group of hackers, usually, who are targeting small businesses and medium enterprises. It's completely random, and it's the exact same process what we've had for spam emails for decades now. Your classic, I have a fortune that I'm willing to send to you. It's the exact same, right? It's bulk casting this problem that we can completely avoid if we have the proper procedures. And again, without sounding like a broken record, if you have a system that's helping you manage that process, then you won't miss those gaps, right? You'll understand where your discrepancies are. And I definitely think the way the future's going, any discrepancy is just going to be more and more obvious to issues like that. So I would say the first thing that we should be looking at is what we can do ourselves. And I'm in no position to legislate anything, but I would be surprised if something isn't coming out soon. I know in the corporate security world, risk management is becoming legislation. Maybe the information world will also follow the same sort of path.
Absolutely. So in short, a lot of this can be avoided by identifying and just doing the basics correctly.
Yeah, it always comes down to the basics.
It's the
every
boring
time.
stuff.
It's the boring stuff, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been really great to chat to you.
No,
I wish you all the best at the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you.